No bullet points, no scene descriptions, and no extra commentary. In the heart of the 14th century, a silent storm gathered in the distant steppes of Central Asia. It traveled not with armies, but with merchants and rats, along the bustling Silk Road. By 1347, it had reached the shores of Europe, carried by Genoese trading ships fleeing a siege at the Black Sea port of Caffa. The ships docked at Messina, Sicily, their crews already dying or dead from a horrifying new sickness. Witnesses described victims developing dark, painful swellings called buboes in their lymph nodes, followed by fever, chills, and vomiting. This was the bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and it moved with a speed and ferocity the medieval world could not comprehend. Within 4 years, this Black Death would sweep across the continent and beyond, killing an estimated 25 to 30 million people in Europe alone, perhaps half of its entire population. This was not merely a health crisis. It was a cataclysm that shattered the very foundations of medieval society. The scale of death was unimaginable. Whole villages were wiped from the map. Mass graves became a common sight as the living struggled to bury the dead. The plague respected no boundary of wealth or status, striking peasant and prince with terrifying equality. Traditional authorities, both the church and the nobility, were powerless to stop it. Their explanations and remedies failed, leading to widespread panic and a crisis of faith. In the desperation that followed, fear turned to violence, and marginalized communities, particularly Jews, were falsely blamed and viciously persecuted. Yet, from the ashes of this devastation, a new world slowly began to emerge. The colossal loss of life created a profound labor shortage. Surviving peasants and workers found their skills in sudden demand, giving them unprecedented power to negotiate for better wages and conditions. This began to unravel the rigid feudal system that had bound peasants to the land for centuries. The old certainties of religion and social order were questioned, planting seeds for future reform and scientific inquiry. The Black Death was a pivot point in human history, an unimaginable tragedy that brutally ended the Middle Ages and forced humanity onto a new, uncertain path. The world that rebuilt itself in the plague's aftermath would be fundamentally different, a world poised for the revolutions of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern age. Imagine a world where the social contract, the very glue of civilization, begins to dissolve. That was the stark reality after the plague's first horrific wave. With up to half the population gone, the consequences rippled through every facet of life. Fields lay fallow, not for lack of land, but for a devastating lack of hands to work it. This scarcity became the survivor's most potent asset. For the first time, the common laborer held undeniable power. Serfs, once bound to their lord's estate, could now demand payment for their work. They fled villages offering low wages, seeking better terms elsewhere, their mobility chipping away at the foundations of serfdom. Lords were forced to pay more, convert land to less labor-intensive pastures, or see their wealth simply rot on the vine. The economic order of centuries was turned upside down overnight, not by war or decree, but by microscopic biology. This great leveling of the population also triggered a crisis of meaning. Why had God allowed this? The church, which offered prayers and processions but no protection, saw its spiritual authority profoundly weakened. People turned to more personal, sometimes more desperate, forms of faith, while others embraced a grim pragmatism in the face of a seemingly random universe. This questioning spirit would later fuel movements demanding reform from within the church itself. Art and literature, too, were forever marked. A darker, more realistic preoccupation with death entered the cultural consciousness, seen in the chilling dance of death motifs that served as a constant memento mori. Yet, paradoxically, the sheer scale of the tragedy also spurred innovation. With fewer people, the need for labor-saving devices grew, accelerating technological thought. The survivors inherited not just a scarred landscape, but a world of new, if hard-won, possibilities. The legacy of the Black Death is etched not in stone, but in the very structure of our modern world. It accelerated the end of feudalism and hastened the rise of a merchant class and a monetary economy. It challenged blind obedience to authority and planted the seeds for the Renaissance's focus on individual human experience. The path from the silent, corpse-laden streets of 1348 to the vibrant, questioning cities of the 15th century runs directly through this great dying. It was a crucible of unimaginable suffering that fundamentally broke the old mold, forcing a shattered society to rebuild, reimagine, and ultimately reinvent itself. The pandemic that changed the world did more than take lives. It irrevocably altered the course of human history, setting the stage for the modern era. As the immediate terror receded, the plague embedded itself not just in memory, but in the very rhythm of life. It became a recurring, if less catastrophic, specter. For over 3 centuries, outbreaks would flare up across Europe, a grim reminder of the world's fragility. This constant threat, however, fueled a slow but profound shift in thinking. While miasma theory, the belief in poisoned air, still held sway, the relentless pattern of contagion led to the world's first crude public health measures. Italian city-states pioneered the concept of quarantine, isolating ships and travelers for 40 days, a period derived from the Italian Quaranta Giorni. Boards of health were established, and the meticulous recording of deaths began, laying the administrative groundwork for modern epidemiology. The plague, in its awful persistence, forced humanity to move from spiritual surrender to systematic observation and containment. The true nature of the medieval killer, however, remained a ghost in the historical records for over 500 years. The answer lay buried, quite literally. In the late 19th century, as a new pandemic swept Asia, scientists finally identified the culprit, the bacterium Yersinia pestis. And in a stunning convergence of history and science, recent advances have allowed us to exhume the pathogen's ancient DNA from the very mass graves of the 14th century. Genetic analysis has confirmed it was the same bacterium, tracing its lineage and confirming its journey from Central Asia. This direct biological evidence has closed a historical loop, transforming the Black Death from a chapter of medieval horror into a definitive case study in pandemic disease. We now understand the trilogy of its spread: the bacterium, the flea that carried it, and the black rat that carried the flea, a chain of transmission that silently rewrote human destiny along the trade routes of a connected world. Today, we view the Black Death not as a divine punishment or a historical anomaly, but as a sobering lesson in global vulnerability. It stands as the definitive example of how interconnected trade routes can become highways for catastrophe, how ecological shifts can unleash unimaginable human suffering, and how societies fracture and reform under extreme stress. The world it created, one of greater mobility, economic opportunity, and questioning spirit, was forged in the deepest trauma. The echoes of the 14th century remind us that a pandemic is more than a medical event. It is a seismic force that can break the foundations of the old world, for better and for worse, leaving survivors to build anew upon the ruins. The story of the Black Death is ultimately a story of resilience. In the shadow of mass graves, life persisted. Communities slowly reconstituted, families reformed, and the rhythms of sowing and harvest returned. This raw human drive to continue, to rebuild homes, to forge new bonds, to create art even amidst reminders of mortality, is its own powerful legacy. The post-plague world was not a paradise born from tragedy. It was often a harder, more uncertain place, yet one crackling with new energy. The old hierarchies had been shaken, creating space for new voices, new ideas, and a gradual turning away from the medieval worldview towards something more recognizably modern. The Renaissance, with its explosion of art, science, and exploration, did not spring directly from the plague, but it grew in the soil that the pandemic had tilled, a soil fertilized by loss, yet strangely ripe for renewal. We look back now across 7 centuries, not merely as historians chronicling a past calamity, but as fellow humans who have, in our own time, felt the tremors of a global pandemic. The specifics of medicine and science have changed beyond recognition, but the patterns of fear, loss, and the search for meaning reverberate with a haunting familiarity. The Black Death teaches us that pandemics are more than biological events. They are profound human experiences that test societies, accelerate change and expose the bedrock of our resilience. It shows us that the path forward after a great dying is never a simple return to the past, but a slow, collective step into an altered future. The world was changed forever in the 1300s, not just by a bacterium, but by the enduring human spirit that weathered its storm and, against all odds, chose to begin again. From the remote steppes of Asia to the bustling ports of the Mediterranean, the Black Death traced the arteries of a connected world, revealing a fundamental truth that still defines our age. In a global community, there is no such thing as a distant threat. The crisis of the 14th century forged the tools of quarantine and public health, ignited social and economic revolutions that dismantled an old order, and imprinted a lasting awareness of mortality and chance onto the human psyche. It stands as a stark monument in our shared history, a reminder of nature's immense power to disrupt and of society's fragile, yet remarkable, capacity to adapt. The echoes of that distant pandemic are not merely whispers from a vanished past. They are foundational notes in the composition of our modern world. As we navigate the challenges of our own century, the story of the Black Death endures, a testament to the trials of humanity and our persistent, unyielding will to emerge from the shadow, to rebuild, and to understand our place in an ever-changing world. The bones rest now, silent in their mass graves. The frantic prayers and panicked cries have faded into the wind that whispers over the fields of Europe. What remains is not just a chronicle of death, but a record of life's stubborn persistence. The Black Death receded, becoming a scar upon history and a ghost in our genes. But in its wake, humanity did not simply survive, we transformed. The world that emerged from the shadow of the plague was leaner, more skeptical, more curious, and more fiercely determined to shape its own destiny. The story of the Black Death is, therefore, not an epilogue to the Middle Ages, but a prologue to our modern world. It is a reminder that from the deepest darkness, light is not merely found. It is built, brick by brick, by the hands of those who remain. And so, we close the chapter. We have walked through the valley of this great dying, from its silent origins to its world-altering end. We have seen the fragility of civilizations and the resilience of the human spirit laid bare by a microscopic foe. The plague years passed, the immediate terror subsided, but the mark was permanent. It is a mark not just of loss, but of change, a brutal, involuntary pivot in the long human story. We are left, then, not with an ending, but with a legacy. A legacy written in the languages of commerce, art, science, and society that we still speak today. The Black Death, the pandemic that changed the world, asks us one final, lingering question. When the next great storm passes, what world will we build from the pieces it leaves behind?